Our first reading today is from Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 to 39. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it.
I've come to this spot here, this stone, because 331 years ago, a 41-year-old man lay next to this stone. He had just been injured in battle, the Battle of Killiecrankie, just a few moments ago. He'd come off his horse and he lay next to this stone and uttered his last words. The man was James Graham of Claverhouse, and he's later on immortalised as Bonnie Dundee, 1st Viscount Dundee. He had led his army to a stunning victory over the government soldiers who had come up to try and relieve Blair Castle, this pass here being one of the few routes through the Highlands that the government soldiers could take. He'd beaten an army which was 1,000 men stronger than his, but he had been killed in the last few moments. The story goes that as he lay dying here, Dundee turned to one of his soldiers and said, "How goes the day?" And the soldier replied, "It goes well for King James, but less well for his lordship." And Dundee is said to have replied, "If it goes well for King James, it matters the less for me." One of the stories that comes out of the Jacobite struggles, of which this tragically was only the first. 2,000 men died here on that day in 1689. Later on there would be other battles in Dunkeld and Cromdale in that year, and then later on the rebellion of 1715, and then of course the 45, where thousands were killed at Culloden. And when you read of those Jacobite soldiers giving their all for these Stuart kings, for King James and then his son James the Old Pretender and then Bonnie Prince Charlie, there's a feeling you have of why? Why are you giving up your life for this lot? And even worse is the feeling that the kings seem to expect this. Some of the depictions of Bonnie Prince Charlie is that he has simply assumed that when the Highlanders died for him at Culloden, they were simply giving him his due. And when you read the words of Jesus, you don't get sentiment that's far away from that. Jesus said, unless someone takes up his cross and dies for me, he's not worthy of me. These are demanding words. Jesus says in this passage in Matthew that we've just read, if you don't acknowledge me in this life, I'm not going to acknowledge you in heaven. And if you reject me in this life, I'm going to reject you in heaven. There's no escaping from the total demand that Jesus makes of disciples. And that if we're to follow Christ, it is something which demands everything of us. If we don't rebel against this, I don't think we've heard the starkness, the plainness of the call. One of the people who talked most about this was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In his writings on discipleship, he said when Jesus calls a man, he calls him to come and die. Bonhoeffer railed against what he called cheap grace, which he said was baptism without repentance. He said it was forgiveness without repentance, baptism without commitment. He said it was grace without Christ, grace without church, grace without God. And I first of all want to say, yes, that Christ makes demands on us, and I want us to think today, what is the demand that Christ makes of us? Where is the call for us now, and where is it we feel we want to hold back? Because Christ demands that we go with him. If he was called a devil, Beelzebul, then when we follow him, we're going to be called much worse. So the first question I think this passage brings us to today is, where is the call? Where is the demand? But it's more complicated than that. And in order to explore that, we're going to look at the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We're going to look at one of the stories of one of the men who fled from this battle, and also look at a little known story that's right at the beginning of the scriptures. We've come here because I want to think a little bit more about this story of discipleship. This great demand that Jesus makes of us, that we follow him no matter what the cost, the cross, and that he'll look after us eventually on the other side of death. And I want to explore what a difficult task that is, but ultimately the question that it leads us to. I think there's a danger that we can portray the Christian life as something through which we can emerge unscathed. I also came here because I wanted to think about this most famous thing about the Battle of Killiecrankie, which isn't actually the death probably of Bonnie Dundee, but actually the story of a Jacobite soldier, Donald MacBain, who running away after the Highland rout late in the afternoon, the Highlanders had come down just probably not far from the hills where we are now. They'd come down and charged on the redcoats, the government soldiers, and it sent them into disarray. And one of them, Donald MacBain, had managed to grab a horse and get away from the site of the battle till he came here, and he knew that he was being pursued by Highland soldiers, Jacobite soldiers. So he managed to get here, and we'll see this in a wee bit. He managed to escape. I want to think about stories of running away and escaping, because sometimes that's what you don't do, and sometimes that's what you have to do. The Bonhoeffer story is interesting because after that big call for discipleship, to avoid cheap grace, the phrase, when Jesus calls a man, he calls him to come and die, was put to the test. In the early 1940s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was in America, and war was about to break out between America and Germany, and he had the chance to stay in America. In fact, people begged him to stay, but he went back. He became involved in the German resistance, and he was arrested in 1943, went to Tegel prison and then later on Flossenburg. And on the outside, Bonhoeffer's story was a classic story of discipleship. People talked about the cheerfulness that he radiated, his sense of the presence of God. Prisoners would try and arrange their exercise times or their work duties so that they could spend a little bit of their day with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But Bonhoeffer's letters from prison reveal a different story. They tell the story of a man in torment, a man actually struggling to hold on to his faith. He wrote in one of them that one of the things he didn't miss was not having to go to church. It's one of the great saints of the 20th century, saying in prison, "I don't miss church in the slightest." But he asked the question, who am I? He said, am I this contented person that everybody sees? Because if you see that, really what you're seeing is a work of theatre, an act, a performance. Said inside, I know far greater despair. I hold on to my faith, I am homesick. And he said, I find little comfort in, for example, psychology, which he'd studied. And he was a man who was struggling to hold on, and that's part of the story of discipleship that we've got to tell. Otherwise, we'll just end up creating a bunch of people who act or who feel that they never truly belong because their story doesn't fit to the perfect story. So to help us think about that part of discipleship, we're going to tell the story of someone in the Old Testament who we don't think about too often, who had to run away. One of the things I think I'm taught by Dietrich Bonhoeffer's story and the story that we're about to hear is that discipleship isn't so much becoming like a semi-monk, about getting up early in the morning and of being able to be disciplined and reading the scriptures and prayer. I think there's a real place for all of that. But I think discipleship is any journey which leads to us making a bigger acknowledgement of Christ, of God, and of Christ acknowledging us. It's that two-way thing. And one of the things the scriptures teach us is that this has no set pattern, this has no perfect shape to it. So one of the people who teaches us this is Hagar. Now, Hagar's story appears in the very early stories of Israel. She appears round the side of the story, but somehow her marginal story actually points to the whole. We first of all meet her in Genesis chapter 16, where Abraham and Sarah have been given this promise that in their old age, or it's now their old age, they're going to have children. And this isn't happening. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, decides to take things into her own hands or into someone else's hands and says, listen, you can go and sleep with my slave girl, Hagar. We're not told if Hagar has any choice in this matter, but that's what happens, and Abraham seems to go along with this, and Hagar becomes pregnant. And the text says that when Hagar has become pregnant, she begins to treat her mistress Sarah with contempt, to the extent that she has to run away. She goes to the desert, and in the desert, a remarkable thing happens to Hagar, which hasn't happened really to anybody in the scriptures up to this point. She has a direct encounter with God, and more than that, she receives a promise from God that her son will also be a nation. And then she does something incredible. She names God. She says, God is the one who sees me. Hagar is probably the Bible's first theologian. And it happens through this journey of running away, of having to run away, of being forced into difficult circumstances. So we're going to hear a part of Hagar's story now, read for us from Genesis chapter 21.
Our second reading is Genesis chapter 21, verses 14 to 20. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer.
There's almost a repeat. Now Sarah has become pregnant, and she says these great lines that we're going to hear later on. When she becomes pregnant and gives birth to a child, she calls the child Isaac, which in Hebrew is Yitzhak, which means laughter. And she says, God has made laughter for me. Is anything impossible for God? The laughter carries on into a feast, into a party. There's a celebration when Isaac gets slightly older and gets weaned. But then the laughter turns sour, because Sarah looks and she sees Isaac laughing, or the word in Hebrew might mean being mocked by Hagar's son Ishmael. And at that point something in her snaps. she turns to Abraham and says, she needs to go. Hagar and Ishmael need to go. Abraham is distressed by this, goes to God, and according to the text, the voice of God is that Abraham should let Ishmael and Hagar go. So they do. They go on this terrible journey into the desert, one in which the supplies in which Abraham has given them run out. And Hagar takes her son Ishmael and puts him under a bush, writes as if he's a child, although according to the text he's a teenager at this point. Puts him under a bush and says, I can't look on him dying. A poignant story about children and parents being separated from each other, a poignant story about refugees, even a story perhaps about social distancing. And then we get a repeat of Genesis 16, where Hagar this time doesn't see God, but sees an angel of God, and the angel reminds her of the promise that she received, that her great hope, that her son will live, that her son will have a story, is still going to be kept true. And I think Hagar's story teaches me that discipleship is any journey, no matter how messy and disjointed, which leads to us having a new understanding of God. But more than that, also of our story being brought into God's story. I'm not able to leap across Soldier's Leap, but we are going to try this journey. It's quite a difficult journey. You can see Tom and Anna here have been helping us. We're going to have to go down through some quite tricky undergrowth. We're going to take this quite big heavy canoe, and it's been raining overnight, so the water's quite high, and I haven't canoed in quite a long time. So we're going to see how we get on this journey to try and get to the other side of Soldier's Leap. To get up here, I'm not going to go much further, but we do not know how Donald McBean managed this. There seems to be no obvious spot where you can climb. But Donald McBean's escape, his flight, reminds me of Hagar's flight, that both of them lived. That's the story. And also my sympathies in these stories do kind of lie with the Jacobites, I hate to say. Hope that's not an admission. But Donald McBean, he was fighting for the other side, and his story is kind of the most celebrated story of the Battle of Killiecrankie, the guy who made an incredible escape. And Hagar's story is that as well, that somehow against all the odds, and in a situation which was entirely forced upon her by other people, you could argue that because she looked at her mistress with contempt, that she was some responsibility, but that seems to me to verge into kind of blame the victim. That Hagar lived. She, like Donald McBean, made it across. And I suppose Jesus' promise is that we will make it to the other side. That discipleship is a journey which ultimately, if you trust him, he'll bring you across the river, across the waters of death, into a place where you still live. And Hagar has stood for many women over the years. She stood for the African woman. She was an Egyptian. She stood for the slave woman. She's stood for the refugee. She stood for all those who looked at a woman like Sarah and said, Sarah's the chosen one and my story is the outsider story. Hers is a story of discipleship, which is very different from the classic story of I put my trust in the Lord and I was good and it all worked out okay. Hers is a story of simply holding on to life and discovering that she's held. It's a story of asking the question, who am I? What am I to be? But ultimately discovering that the real question is, who is God? Can he hold me? Can he get me to life? And discovering that next to the question, who is God? And the question, what is my story? Is discovering that my story, Hagar's story, becomes part of God's story, which is a story of life. So I don't know who you identify with that we've thought about today, whether it be Jesus and his call for brave discipleship, whether it's Sarah, the woman of privilege, but ultimately a woman who's still vulnerable, whether it's the story of Donald McBean simply having to run away and do impossible things just to stay alive. I don't know what your story is, but ultimately I think the story of discipleship is somehow giving ourselves to this call of Christ, which asks of us everything, and discovering that God holds us and that he brings us to the other side. So God be with you in your story, which is his story, the story of life. Amen.
The sun comes up, it's a new day dawning. It's time to sing your song again. Whatever may pass and whatever lies before me, let me be singing when the evening comes. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, oh my soul. Worship his holy